Awesome. Okay, because I'm tall and I'm handsome, but I do mumble, so I apologize in advance. All right, you probably saw that we were messing about. We had some technical difficulties, so fingers crossed this is all right. All right, can everybody, nope, all right, can everybody see that or, no? Okay, everybody see that? Damn, all right, well, to your heart's content, where all of the information that's in your fingertips, support your life. Unless you're old, or disabled, and therein lies the problem. We suffer because our living is. You know what? Okay, thanks a lot. I was Billy Gregory. Well, it's not going to get any better than that. Come on. So, yes, hello. My name is Billy Gregory. I'm from the Passy Elder Group. I'm the Director of Training. In my spare time, I like to tour around and make an ass of myself on stage. So, hello. I wanted to talk today a bit about UX and design and development and all of that stuff. And I really want to talk about how in our race to be modern and cool and whatever else, we've left out a lot of users. But really what this talk is about is me putting my money where my mouth is. Because a couple years ago, I tweeted this. When UX doesn't consider all users, shouldn't it be known as some user experience or sucks? That tweet caught fire, and I mean, not caught fire, but caught fire by my standards. So it had a few hundred retweets, and people started asking, well, what do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean? So I figured it was time for me to explain what it was that I was talking about a couple of years ago. I don't know if you're going to learn anything you don't already know, but you're already here, right? So we might as well have some fun with it. I've been called provocative. I don't know that that's entirely true. I do like to call bullshit on the accessibility industry when I think it's got its head up its own ass. Hence the new accessibility logo that I pitched at CSUN this year. It didn't go over well. I'm also one half of this duo on the bottom called The Viking and the Lumberjack. We're a web series all about accessibility. We like to poke fun at accessibility. We like to have fun with it. And really just make everyone understand that not everybody in the accessibility industry is this angry dude with a pitchfork that's going to chase you down every time you screw something up. In fact, a lot of us are really cool. Like I said, I've been called provocative. I'm not sure that really fits. Truth be told, I'm not really a UX expert either. Truth be told even more, I'm not even a UX professional. What I am is a 44-year-old father of two with really crap eyesight and a bad back. I understand where this leaves me. I can see all the signs, and I know what's going on here. I'm living on a learning curve. You see, I see my daughters, and the way they embrace technology is nothing short of fantastic. They can pick up new apps and technologies like that, and they're fine. And then I see my parents. They struggle a little bit with technology. That's my dad's attempt at using FaceTime. I've had a lot of conversations with his thumb and my mom's nostrils. It's great. The three of them are doing well. And it's not just limited to my family. My friend Patrick tweeted this a little while ago saying, I'm trying to find a music app for iOS that my dad would understand and failing. It's all gesture-based. And then he goes on to thank designers and developers for their not so hard work. So I see all of this. I see my parents on one end of this learning curve and my daughters on the other, and I'm not stupid. I know where this is heading. And it's not going to be good. The older I get, I realize I am slowly turning into a hairy pile of garbage. My body is breaking down. There's nothing I can do about this. But I've got to be honest, I prefer hairy pile of garbage to the alternative, which is death. I don't want to die, but I probably will. I haven't so far, so I mean, as far as I know, I'm immortal, but there's probably a good chance that at some point in my life, I will not be alive. How many people in this room had a birthday last year? Well, there could be Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, so hopefully you want to keep having those birthdays, or at least keep getting older. And, I'm sorry, spoiler alert, you're going to die too. I know, and you know what?
That sucks!
So yes, while this talk is about accessibility, it's really about all of us, like you and you and you and you and you. really just everybody in this room, okay, disabled or not, we all use the internet and we're all going to need some features at some point. All of us. Every single person. So I love the internet, and I do believe that everyone should be able to use it. That's the one serious part of this talk. And unfortunately, you know, we set about and we're trying to have this positive impact on our audience, but we're trying to introduce, you know, freedom and access to information, but instead we introduce boundaries. And inclusive should never have boundaries. The internet was supposed to be this open and fantastic place where we could explore, this information superhighway, where all of the information is right there for us, and we could just go and get it and bring it back. Unfortunately, for a lot of users out there, it's nothing more than a broken cow path, leading to frustration and probably a reminder that 99.9% of the world views them as an afterthought. And you know what? That sucks! You see, I work in accessibility. I already said this. I'm an expert, TM. I audit code for a living, okay? I do training, and when I'm not doing that, I'm auditing code. I'm out there, and I'm looking at code and telling people what they did wrong. And one thing has become crystal clear to me over the 8 years or so that I've been doing this. The internet sucks. The internet is really only built for some people. And that's not cool. Because when you break it down, accessibility isn't really much more than amazing design brought together by brought to life by even better code. And that's where you all come in. I said this morning. How many people were in the opening talk, the panel that we did, a few of us? Oh, only a few of you. Awesome, good, so I can reuse a lot of the same jokes. Saves me a lot of work. I only appear clever. I'm not really that smart. Okay, so there's plenty that designers. How many designers do we have in the room right now? Awesome, okay. So there's lots that you could be doing up front right away, because there's so much of the internet out there that we half-ass, that we get wrong, that we screw up on a daily basis. A few of the things that we get wrong, and as developers, I want you to listen to this too. We screw up headings. We screw up lists. We screw up forms. We screw up focus management. We screw up contrast. And you know what? We literally screw up anything to do with this, the keyboard. Anything to do with keyboard interactions, we get wrong 9 times out of 10. To give you some context here, to show you what I mean, I'll give you an example of what the internet might look like to us normal users if these same obstacles occurred. So let's remove the headings from CNN.com, otherwise known as the most depressing website on the planet these days. I'm Canadian, by the way, not American, so have at it. So I've outlined all the headings on this page. Without those headings, all the text just disappears. It just sort of washes out and it's not useful. Now, CNN is actually a really bad example to use when we're talking about heading structure. Because if we were to outline all of the headings on the CNN.com, every single line of text on the homepage is a heading. And when everything's a heading, nothing's a heading. Because headings are supposed to provide structure. This isn't providing anything. Let's take a look at what a form would look like if it was unlabeled to us. When we don't label our forms properly, this is what it looks like to a blind user. Just a bunch of inputs that just say text, text, radio button, text, whatever. It doesn't really help anybody, right? How about image galleries that don't have any alt text? That looks like nothing. Or we can talk about complex keyboard controls, custom elements that we can tab into and not out of, that provides this sort of quicksand-like keyboard trap where we're just stuck for all eternity. And you know what? For a lot of people with disabilities, you guessed it, that sucks! I talked about these guys, Viking and Lumberjack. Anybody that is familiar with the Viking and Lumberjack know we have a lot of fun with this kind of thing. We like to point out things that we do in our daily lives that represent what we do on the internet, like building custom components and not really telling people what they do. Just because we slap a label on something and calling it a button doesn't make it a button. We use a lot of sort of accessibility features that don't really help anybody in the long run. We call them, vanity accessibility features, like text enlargers or things that override, components they already have or settings they already have on their own computers. We also tried to rebrand accessibility to make it cool. So we turned high contrast or low contrast mode into hangover mode. Because anybody that's ever had more than one alcoholic beverage in a night and then woken up too early knows how bright their phone can be when they look at it first thing in the morning. It almost burns your eyes out of your head. So I mean, for a lot of people, that's their daily life. If they have light sensitivity, this is how a bright screen can react to them. But there are so many designs out there that we think we're being inclusive with that fall just short of being, accessible. At the last minute, we introduce these barriers. This is actually a patio by my house in Toronto. It's like a Dairy Queen or something like that. But yeah, they have this table, which is awesome. It's got this, spot for a wheelchair and then a step getting up to it. So, unless you're really good at ollieing or something, you're not going to get up there. So there are so many designs that focus on one user group and one user group alone. Any user that deviates from this normal user is ignored. So congrats on a job half done. We haven't gone the full way. We need to honor the rest of the commitment we've made to these users by making these sites usable. Because when we don't, that sucks! We've talked a lot about my qualifications as a UX professional. This hasn't changed in the last 10 minutes or so. But like I said, I do work with code on a daily basis. I audit it a lot. I audit all the time. So I think I do have some insight that other folks might not have just based on the amount of work I do around inaccessible code. And I can tell you without a doubt that some design sucks. It really doesn't take everyone into consideration. And unfortunately, what we've told you to do with these designs also sucks, because we have a lot of these best practices that are out there that don't really work. Let's take a look at tabs and tab panels. These things are still highly contentious. We are still arguing about how best to make these. There's no native elements for HTML that support these just yet. We don't have design patterns that everyone can agree on. In fact, a lot of these don't even exist in current area design pattern documents. So it's really hard to tell somebody that they're doing something wrong when we haven't really told them how to do it right. Because there's a bunch of different users that don't even know that you're not supposed to tab through tabs. You're supposed to use your arrow keys to navigate through them. None of those tabs that aren't the active tab are supposed to receive focus. How many people in the room knew that? Exactly, right? Okay, so Whitney, but she wrote a book about that, so that's not fair. And then we have these things, carousels. I would love to burn every carousel in the world to the earth and then salt it. I despise these things. They are, accessibility nightmares. They don't do anything. Nobody likes them. There's all kinds of studies that show that everybody hates them. By the time you get to the second or third dot, you've totally tuned out. It was there. They were invented a long time ago because somebody wanted to keep all this information above the fold. The fold died a long time ago. We can all agree on that. Screw the fold. Screw carousels. Carousels made me sick as a child, and they make me sick as an adult. And then we have these, drag and drop and date pickers. Now, elephant in the room, I'll just say what we're all thinking. They both sound like dodgy terms for internet dating. It's true. We got that out of the way now, right? All right, good. Honestly, of the two, drag and drop is probably the easier to make happen in the real world. Because we can fudge that with some radio buttons and some controls to move stuff from one side to the other. We can totally make that accessible without too much trouble. Date pickers, on the other hand, are a real pain in the ass. 10 times out of 10, I would much rather just enter text into a field than have to fumble through this clumsy sort of calendar to find the date. Now, if you give me the option of doing text and a date picker, cool. Some people might want that date picker. But for a lot of people, they won't. And for a developer, to make this accessible, I talked about design patterns before. For those of you who don't know, design patterns are basically a lot of keyboard commands that we spell out for you that are supposed to, be there for common keyboard interaction. That's the design pattern for a date picker. So all of those are keyboard commands that you need to, preserve in order to make this thing fully accessible. It is a nightmare. In fact, this doesn't even exist in the current ARIA 1.1 document, because they're still arguing over how to make this accessible. They still don't agree that this is the best approach. I want you to meet my friend Johnny. I promised in the talk this morning that I would tell his story a little bit later. Johnny wasn't born like this. Johnny woke up like this when he was 19 years old. He was coming home from a concert, and he got T-boned by another car. He woke up like this 2 months later. He couldn't move. He could barely breathe. He couldn't talk, couldn't do anything. He was what they call locked into his own body. So all he could do was blink. Over time, Johnny regained some muscular control. He can move his hands enough to work his wheelchair now. He can type. He can give me the finger, which takes me about 2 minutes to do, but I can see it coming. He's also one of my best friends, and he's also the guy that tweets out. So I run an organization called A11YTO, or an accessibility camp out of Toronto, and he's one of my co-orgs. So he does a lot of the sort of the background work. We were at a conference a little while ago, and we were all sitting around and we were asking ourselves, what's the definition of done for accessibility? When do we know that something is accessible? And we were all, you can imagine what a bunch of accessibility experts at a conference would sound like when somebody asked a question like that. We all sort of put on our big tough guy, puffed out our chests, and we started giving these long-winded answers about what we thought made an accessible website. And Johnny just started kind of chuckling. And we're like, well, what do you think, Johnny? Johnny looks at us, and he types on his iPad a lot of the time because he doesn't really have the control to push out words. Doesn't have the strength in his lungs. So he just sat there typing for a minute, turned his iPad so we can face it. So it faced us. And his answer was really simple. When I can use it. That's what accessibility is to him. He just wants to be able to do what all of his friends can do online. That's it, in a nutshell. So, I mean, for that, we need proper design, right? My friend Ian had this great quote that said, "It pains me to say this, but web developers might not be the most important people when it comes to making accessible websites and apps." Which is true. A lot of it should fall on the designers rather. The design team has to answer a lot of that question for the developer right up front. Things like the first question, will anyone want to use this? On the screen, there's a series of buttons that I found in the Toronto International Airport asking someone to push a button to rate the cleanliness of a bathroom. They want people who just came out of the bathroom to rate the cleanliness. I will never use that feature, ever. Raise your hand if you would push that button. You are brave. You are also the second, only one of two people. There's a guy in the back that also put up his hand. I might use like my elbow, maybe? I don't know. And then you have to ask yourself, can it be made accessible? Is it something that makes sense to do in that context? And will it take too long to do it? Is it worth the trouble, right? So we've got some design requirements we can think about right away. And these are things that the visual designer and the UX designer should have sorted out before it goes to development. But they should also try to loop developers into this conversation early to have these conversations. We need to talk about color contrast. We already mentioned contrast, but we also have to talk about the meaning of the color. So if we're using colors in different contexts, what do they mean? And when should they be used? And how should they be used? We need to talk about structure. We should map that out because our code tells a story. Every element has a job to do, and we need to make sure that the developer understands that this is a heading for this area of the page. We need to map that out. Developers are too busy learning a new framework every 10 minutes these days to worry about all the small stuff that really should be from the designers. My friend Ian again, because he's a really smart dude, awesome guy, huge Iron Maiden fan. But he always says that like, we can give the developer a picture of a cake, or we can give them the recipe. So it's up to UX to give them the recipe, right? Visual design handles the picture of the cake, but they need to know how to bake it. They need a recipe for that. So we also need to talk about focus and content order, okay? So the order that things are marked up on the page should match the order that they receive focus. That's like WCAG, 101. We need to make sure that we preserve that because there's a lot of keyboard only users who might not be blind that might want to try to follow that path, and if it's jumping around, it's too hard. We also want to talk about focus states. So if we're talking about a nav or something like that and someone's focusing through it, we want to make sure that everyone can understand what those focus states are. So we need visible focus. And then if we're building mobile, we need to talk touch target size. And I mean, not just following the Apple developer guidelines, because those are great. They tell you how big buttons should be. But I have really fat thumbs. And I fat thumb everything. And nothing says I'm a creepy stalker like fat thumbing like an Instagram post from somebody from like 20 years ago when you're scrolling their feed or something, right? So I don't want to be the creep dude that tries to scroll and ends up liking a million photos that I shouldn't be liking. And we need to describe how custom components work whenever we can, right? If we're building something complex because not UX, these visual designers do not like the way native form elements work, so developers always have to rebuild them from nothing. We need to describe how that's supposed to work. And then we should have a long argument about why we don't really need that. Nobody is ever going to leave your site in disgust because you used a native form element. I promise you. I did promise that I would be somewhat controversial today. So let's do it. I trust a lot of the developers in the room are familiar with what this is. There was an old saying years ago that said it better work without JavaScript. This was like old school accessibility, like pre-jQuery stuff. And this was actually part of like, old requirements saying we needed to, this needed to work without JavaScript. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? These days, having a website in 2017 that works without JavaScript is like having a house without plumbing. We need it. And when you think about it, JavaScript and plumbing do a lot of the same things because they both deal with a lot of shit we don't want to have to deal with. But here's the thing. Speaking of crap, you're going to have to deal with a lot of it because you're going to have to make some tough choices. You're going to have to leave some people behind sometimes. I'm not advocating you just say, screw all the disabled people, but there are some instances where we would probably tell you, yes, you're going to have to do this thing and maybe do something else. A great example is maps. Maps are intensely visual things. It's really hard to make a map fully accessible for a blind user. But we would never tell you, or at least I would never tell you as an accessibility professional, don't use a map because that's ridiculous. We need them. We all use them within reason. Obviously, some people don't. But I would never say not to do it. Now, let's look forward a little bit. We talked about this morning. Virtual reality and augmented reality. We can do a lot of cool stuff with that. And there's a lot of really awesome things we can do to make the lives of the disabled better. Just because it's a visual experience right now doesn't mean it has to stay that way. But at the same time, I would never say, well, we can't do anything more with virtual reality until blind people can use it too. Because think of all the other lives that we could affect this way. I mean, we can give somebody who's lying in a bed somewhere the opportunity to go on vacation somewhere. Or, we can put people in touch and make them experience cool new things. It's more than just pretending to be Batman for a couple of minutes. There's lots of really cool things we could do, but I would never tell you not to do it because of, a certain group. That doesn't mean we have to leave them out forever. If we're working in an agency, maybe we can start a list of issues that we've had to leave people behind on. Maybe we can start a champions network where we revisit these issues once a month over lunch and be like, hey, anybody see an article that might help one of these things? And then, yeah, okay, let's circle back. Then we can go back to our client and say, hey, we just figured out a way to fix this thing. Give me money. And they'll be like, yeah, have some money. And we'll be like, all right, we all have money, cool. And then the blind people are happy, you're happy because you've got more money, and the client's happy because nobody's calling them threatening to sue them anymore. Good question for you. This is sort of an interesting dilemma. It might not have an answer. But I wanted to give you a real world example of a tough decision. I'm going to ask Whitney to stay out of this one because she's going to know the answer. Or she at least will have an answer. This is a popular shoe site in the United States, okay? I don't know how easy it is to see this, but on the first shoe, there's sort of a blue outline around it. It's very, very faint in this situation. And then on the one beside it, there's a quick view button that pops up. The first one is the view you get when you navigate to it with the keyboard. Second one is the view you get when you hover over it with the mouse. Now, when we click that quick view button with the mouse, we get this overlay that brings up all of this information, okay? It's great. We can quick order, we can order the shoe, it's got product reviews, what colors are available, pretty much everything you need to order that shoe. We don't have that same option with the first one because we don't get a quick view button. When we click on it, we're brought to a product page that has all of the same information and a tiny little bit more. Do you think that's okay? Would you be okay recommending this as yeah, you know what, they've got the access to the same information, that's fine. Nobody wants to be brave enough to actually voice an opinion. That's cool, no one ever does. I think it's bullshit. I think it's a cop-out and I think it's lazy. I think, yes, they've got the same access to the information, but you're making them take extra steps to get to it and then to get back. What if they don't want that shoe when they get there? What if they realize that is a really ugly shoe? And then they're like, I got to go back now. So now I got to use my keyboard back. I got to find where I was on that page. I got to go everything. Whereas the other person just had to dismiss a dialogue. There's no reason why we can't manage focus and open up a dialogue. We were just too lazy to make a button to open it. So there's a situation where if we had proper UX documentation saying, hey, this is supposed to work with the keyboard, make sure it does, the developer would have been on the hook to deliver that. But if the developer isn't told it has to do that, then they're just going to build it, and it's going to be like, yeah, this works. It's cool. So I'm not blaming any one person here. I'm just thinking that maybe this probably wasn't the best example. And for a lot of people, it works. And for a lot of people, that sucks. We talked about this already. The internet sucks. But unfortunately, it's all we have. You probably don't realize this, but Whitney's in the room right now. She wrote a really great book about this hashtag, accessible user experience. It's called The Web for Everyone. If you haven't read it, you should. If you haven't seen Whitney talk before, you should go to her talk tomorrow. But we have this accessible user experience, and from that has stemmed a people-first design movement. Is anybody familiar with that? Heard that before? Where basically we're designing for the person using the product instead of how the product is going to render on a screen. That's really important, because we got to remember, at the end of the day, these computers aren't using themselves yet. But right now, there's still people running them, so we want to make sure we design for them. Without accessible user experience, a lot of designs sucks, right? Some user experience. But they don't have to be. They can be beautiful user experiences, because beautiful user experiences lead to repeat business, which leads to more money. On the flip side, if we don't do this, we have a very frustrating user experience. And well, that's a story for another time. Thank you very much. I was Billy Gregory.
Thank you, Billy. That was actually really fun and informative.
Actually, really fun. What did you think it was going to be?
So, guys, we have some time for questions. Who's first?
You can ask me questions about my hunky prime minister, too, if you want that instead. He's a good-looking dude. Just legalized marijuana. No?
None? Yes. Thanks, Sophia.
Oh.
So what does, I've never made documentation for accessibility. This is like kind of, I guess, confession time. What does documentation, I guess I could get Whitney's book, but what does your ideal documentation look like for documenting accessibility, documenting keyboard use and labels?
Yeah, so I wouldn't, first of all, I wouldn't create a separate document just for accessibility. I don't want you to get the wrong idea there. But if you're annotating, a PDF design or some wireframes or like that, you should probably highlight any, accessibility stuff you need to add in there. So, when you're talking, in your PDFs, they're all annotated. You've got all sort of the designs and the requirements. Throw the other stuff in there too, like, hey, this is a heading structure. It should be this way. Hey, when the user does this, this is the interaction that should happen with the keyboard. So it's just included with the other wireframes you're hopefully already doing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, don't call it as anything special, because what we want at the end of the day is for accessibility just to be part of the process, right? So we don't want you to think that it has to be its own step. It's just part of the process. If you notice, I said process and process because I do a lot of training in the US and I never know which way to say it. Question? You're getting your exercise today.
Yeah.
All right, now somebody in the back corner asked the next question.
Hey, so
is your question going to be about temporary disabilities?
No.
Okay.
No, but in any case, so you said you look at a lot of code. I presumably are trying to poke holes in what people are doing.
Yeah.
So sort of in your experience, what is maybe the most common thing that people get wrong or they leave out, or and conversely, what's the easiest thing that developers and designers can do to avoid that maybe?
You know, it's awesome. The answer is almost the exact same for both. If I had to pick three things, I'm going to give you three things. You asked for one, I'm going to give you three, because that's how generous I am. The three things that I think people screw up the most online is anything to do with keyboard interaction. So we already talked about that, right? So they always forget that there's users out there who don't use the mouse. Two would be the basics, just semantic HTML. It doesn't get any more accessible than that. We have this saying in our industry saying, get your accessibility for free. a lot of the accessibility comes rolled into these elements automatically. So if we use the right elements, for their intended purpose, we get a lot of accessibility for free right away. And the third one would be anything to do with focus management. So when we open a dialogue, what we're doing is, if you click on a button that says, more information, and please don't use a button that says more information, but, like launch this thing. What we're doing is selling the user a round trip ticket, right? We're saying, it's like picking your buddies up and say, yeah, come out with me and I'll drive you home at the end of the night. We don't just leave our buddy at the side of the road somewhere when we're done. So when you're launching a dialogue, we want to bring them there, manage the focus within that dialogue, and then bring them back to that control when they're done. Those are the three things that I see screwed up most. And I mean, those are probably the easiest to fix. Especially the semantic HTML one.
Any more questions? I have one.
Uh-oh.
How to start off, for example, okay, when I'm doing a designing website, is there a checklist that I should look at? Or maybe there's some software that could actually do an audit of the site?
There's plenty of testing. Now you're talking about testing like a finished, not a finished, but like an in-progress, past design, in development site.
Yeah.
There are a lot of tools out there we can use for auditing on like a high level. My friend Carl makes a great tool called Tenon, which is an API based that you can sort of hook up to, like if you're using Jenkins or something like that, you can build it right in and automate your own tests. There's other sort of browser level tools you can use. A company called DQ makes a great tool called Axe, which you can just run right from Chrome. It's in your developer tools. You just hit Axe and it'll spit out all of the accessibility issues it can find. Webaim.org makes a great tool called Wave. They all sort of do the same thing. They sort of sniff around your code and highlight stuff. Now, I should tell you now that automated tools only catch about 27% of the issues. Because, a testing tool can only tell you if an image has alt text on it, right? It can't tell you if you have a picture of a cat and you've got the alt text of dog that's wrong. Computers just aren't that smart yet. But it'll catch a lot of the high level stuff and remove a lot of the blockers, and then you can test the rest of the keyboard stuff with a keyboard, and then maybe just run the page through a screen reader quickly. You don't have to learn screen readers. You don't have to be a screen reader wizard. But if you can just turn it on and let it read the page, if you're a Mac user, you've got VoiceOver built in. So you can just hit Command F5 and just have it start reading from the top, just to make sure that everything gets announced properly. That's where I'd start.
And as a designer, as a do's and don'ts?
Step one would be to buy Whitney's book. Like I said, I'm not a designer by trade, so I wouldn't want to set you down the wrong path. I would pay attention to a lot of the stuff I talked about. I would, more so than anything, what you don't want to do is waste time, right? Because everyone always says when you mention accessibility, oh, it takes too long and it costs too much money. Well, all that money's burned because you've probably gone down a road that you now have to turn around, or you have to rebuild the road in front of you because you have your card's too wide or something like that. But really what you want to do is make sure that you have this discussion ahead of time. You get everybody on board and understand that accessibility is where we're heading. And, we got a plan for that. So that's probably where I'd start.
Thanks, Billy.
No problem.
Any more questions?
Oh,
I
here we go.
sparked it.
Oh, boy.
I'll
I probably
start off
pissed off
this
all
way.
the designers now.
It's like a backup question, so if there's other ones. No, I was just wondering, because you very, very briefly mentioned color meaning, not just contrast.
Yeah.
If you could elaborate on that quickly, that would be great.
Yeah, so color meaning, like just say we're using red fonts to show errors on a form. We want to make sure that the designer knows that we use this red in this context only for this thing, because now we've made the association. We've told the user that when you see this red text, that's the use case for it. Ideally, we'd want to pair that with an icon or something, so it's not just color representing a certain thing. But that's what I mean. Like, so if we're using color in certain contexts, or like green for completed text, or yeah.
What are your favorite sites that actually get web accessibility right?
I knew I was going to get that question. I get it all the time. Unfortunately, there's no real answer because nobody gets everything right. And I mean, I think 100% accessible site is an unachievable dream for the most part. But there are some sites that get a lot of stuff really, really right. Like BBC. They get a lot of stuff almost perfect because they have a team that's been working on it for so many years that it's really great. So that's probably my go-to in terms of what's great. Now, if you want specific examples of things that work well, there's a Tumblr blog run by Marcy Sutton called A11Y Wins. And she basically just lists things that, like, hey, this page got this, carousel or whatever working perfectly. Check it out. So, I mean, that's a great, searchable example so you can find templates. And then there's also the W3 has a bunch of examples in the way area spec that I showed there, the ARIA 1.1. They link off to some working, fully accessible widgets. So, but as far as like an actual site, we could go there and say, hey, this thing's perfect. Doesn't exist yet. Unless you wanted like a really sort of basic site, but I think you want something probably a little more interactive, right?
Thank you.
Someone here at the back. Who was it? Okay. There's a short sprint.
Okay, thanks. Bill, you were talking about mostly about web experience, and I was concerned about accessibility of mobile applications. Are there any guidelines which can help developers and your designers to make mobile apps more accessible?
Yeah, so there is the web content accessibility guidelines, and I almost got out of this talk without talking about with guidelines, but WCAG exists sort of to help people make the web more accessible, and by default, mobile apps sort of fall under that. Now, there are no mobile-specific guidelines, but a lot of the stuff works. Now, there are some obvious exceptions, like, I don't think Android really recognizes heading structure yet. I don't know if there's any Android developers in the room, they can correct me, but I think there's no real way to mark up like proper headings in Android yet. But a lot of the other stuff does apply, like color contrast. You could totally work on like, interaction, making sure controls are exposed properly. So we call it the accessible name. So if a button has the word confirm in it, the accessible name for that button would be confirm. So we want to make sure that the screen reader announces that text and doesn't just call it a button. So things like that you could do. Now, if you're doing mobile web, then it's exactly the same. It's just a one-to-one mapping.
Yeah, I was talking about native mobile apps.
Yeah, so native apps are a little trickier, I'm not going to lie. Android's even trickier. iOS has a lot of stuff built in with the accessibility enabled option for a lot of the traits. So you can just sort of click that and just say, hey, now it's accessible, and that'll get passed through to VoiceOver. As far as actual guidelines, no, but the Apple developer guidelines and the Android guidelines, I think they both reference accessibility to a certain extent.
Okay, thanks.
Whitney?
Uh-oh.
Oh, no, it's an easy question. I was actually, I just wanted to say something because you've mentioned my book twice, which is it was really written for designers like me who couldn't find my way through one line of code. It's kind of about failures of imagination when we don't make things accessible. But the question I wanted to ask you, one of the things that we think is that when you're making a site responsive, that a lot of the kinds of things you're telling developers about how the design is going to work are the same kinds of things that you need to tell someone about how to make it accessible, what order, how should things stack, and so on. Could you say more about that? Because I sort of got that much, and then I haven't gotten any further.
Yeah, so I struggle with this one, honestly, because, the guidelines say we shouldn't mess with the focus order and the content order and how things are presented from one to another. I don't necessarily agree with that all the time. Like, I get that with responsive, there are a lot of users out there who might be low vision who aren't using it on a mobile device, but they're enlarging their text to trigger those breakpoints so they can see it in a more linear fashion. In that sense, then yeah, we need to start preserving the way things appear. So the focus order, we don't want, if somebody say there's low vision, unfortunately with a lot of disabilities, they come in batches, right? So you might not just be low vision. You might be low vision because of a stroke or something, and you have aphasia, and now you can't process information the same. So we want to make sure that tools are identified consistently all the time. So we don't want to have, if it's like logo, search field, menu, we don't want to all of a sudden switch that around and make it confusing for the user when we switch to the responsive view. Am I answering your question, or am I just talking about something else entirely?
You think it through.
Do I have to keep going?
No, it seemed to me that when I really started thinking about how to design for accessibility, that it was about retraining my own thinking and learning how to imagine how people might experience that site or that app when they interacted with it in a different way or when it appeared to them in a different way.
Yeah.
And that responsive was the first time the whole world started thinking about that.
That's a fair point. I don't even know how to build off that because you said it so eloquently. But it's true. I think it's the perfect example of somebody seeing a site in a different context and you know how things can fall apart rather easily when we don't build it properly to be responsive. I was struggling with that last week in Toronto. I was trying to build our conference site and everything just sort of fell apart when I tried to, you know, play with the breakpoints. And yeah, I honestly don't know how to build off what you're asking here. Easy question, my ass, woman.
Thanks, Whitney. All right, so I think, is there any more questions? I'll stay in the middle.
There's a question over there.
No? Well, thank you very much, Billy. Big round of applause.
Thank you.